Mr. Andy Bell, everyone. Andy.
Hello, hello, hello. How are we all doing? What a day, eh? All day of yay. It's been a really good day of talks. I've been ripping Josh all the way through this for putting me at the end of the bill because he knows how much of a nervous speaker I am. And he was like, oh yeah, you can just go at the end. But I am really privileged to be closing the show today because the standard of talks has just been so damn high. And now I've got 40 minutes of me chatting rubbish. So let's go. Right. The aim of the game today is I'm going to change how you write CSS. And I'm going to do that by using my clicker, by using fluid type, fluid space, flexible layouts, all underpinned by progressive enhancement. And there's a reason for this. It's because we build for everyone. The web is a truly global space. We don't build for ourselves, nor our peer group. We've got to build for everyone. And this is why I've leaned really heavily into progressive enhancement over the years, because you never know what someone's device is going to be doing, right? You don't know whether there's going to be browser extensions pulverizing the page. You don't know whether they're going to be in a corporate network that's blocking resources left, right, and center. So you can't rely on fragile requirements in order to build your page. And I can guarantee to you now that no one's ever going to complain about getting a good experience. And by using progressive enhancement, people might not get the same experience as each other, but they'll get an experience that works instead. And that, to me, is proper web design. So everyone get your laptops out. We're going to code some CSS. I'm only joking. Don't worry. Saw a few bit of sweat then. Well, right, this is an exam. Now, what I've done, right, is to make this talk a little bit more fun, is I've built a website, and I'm going to show you how to build it from scratch, right from the HTML all the way up to something that looks pretty good. Now, if you go to this URL on your device, and it doesn't matter what device you've got, because the way that this website's been built is truly responsive web design, and it should look great in whatever device you open it on. Now, if you're comfortable, go ahead and show it to the person that you sat next to and show them what you see. And if you're really comfortable, and this is really comfortable, take a screenshot and share it on the conference hashtag so everyone else can see that everyone should have a different experience, but it should always look good regardless of what device you've got, unless you've got A6, of course. But this is the website. If you've not had a chance to load it, this is the website that I've done. Now, this is a two-part, really, this website, because you could just read this and then walk out, because that's the talk. But the whole aim of the game is it's almost like one of those cringy manifestos that people write. It's showing you all the tools and all the tricks to build truly responsive websites for people. So we're going to break this down now and actually start to build it. I've got to get some boring stuff though, because you know we all like to talk about tools. I really hate talking about tools, they're really boring. But just so you know, like all the CSS that you see today, it's all been smushed together with some post CSS. And it's gasp, using Tailwind as well. But it's also using a CSS methodology as well, because building it all with Tailwind might be a bit silly. So what we're using is a CSS methodology called CubeCSS. And what a methodology is, it's a set of rules and principles that help you to organize your CSS and also help you make decisions too, because you shouldn't have to be making decisions while you're writing code. You should be focusing on making a good user experience instead. And what CubeCSS is, it's a methodology that's orientated towards simplicity, pragmatism, and consistency. And it's designed to work with the medium that you're working in, often the browser, rather than against it, mentoring versus micromanaging. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about CubeCSS today because A, it's pretty boring, and B, I've done this before already in talks. So if you go to this URL, there's documentation, examples, there's some screencasts that I've done once upon a time, and all sorts of bits and pieces. If you're into this sort of thing, then you know, Godspeed. But yeah, it's worth having a look at. So what I will do though, is I want everyone to be on the same page as each other. So I'm going to give you a quick whiz through about what CubeCSS is and what it's all about. And it's broken up into 5 parts. There's global CSS, layout compositions, utilities, component blocks, and then exceptions that go with those blocks, and compositions and utilities. Now, the global CSS is the most important part. We try and do as much as we can as high up as possible. We want to declare as much CSS as we can that gets inherited and cascaded down the page, because rather what seems to happen with certain tooling and tricks is that people apply styles to direct elements every single time, constantly repeating themselves and creating themselves a big stinking heap of technical debt. Now, what we're trying to do is remove that and actually write as little CSS as possible, because life's too short, right? So we've done our global CSS, we've styled loads of stuff up as high as possible, and then we might want to start looking at some layout, because, you know, we like to make things look good. And what the composition layer's job is to create these skeletal layouts that are completely component agnostic. It doesn't matter what you put in them, they'll just lay themselves out automatically, regardless of viewport, regardless of capability, they'll just work. Then we want to get into the details. We want to start making things look cool. So we start looking at utilities. And just like in Cassidy's talk then, like these utilities do one job and do one job well in the context of Cube CSS. So what they might do is set a background color, or they might just set a text color. But also a utility might be a concise collection of properties that say push all the content into the middle of the page, for example. They just do one job and do that one job well. A bit like Ron Seal. And then we get into the real details, right? This is when we start making things look really cool. And this is when we get into our components, or what I like to call them blocks, mainly because it made the acronym sound better. But the idea of a block is that you're going against what you've already set with global CSS. So this might be your card component or your button component. It doesn't really matter, but at this point, you should be writing quite a small amount of CSS because you've done so much already with the other parts. And then finally is exceptions. And this is the only time that I like to have rigorous control over the UI. Now, what an exception is a state change. So what you might have done in previous methodologies, say like with BEM, for example, you might add an extra class to create a modifier. But the problem with that is that you can add as many classes as you like to an element. So you don't truly know what state your component's in at any given time. So what an exception allows you to do, because you use HTML data attributes instead, is have finite state. And at this point, everything else is super flexible, but there is times where you do really want that control. So what these exceptions do is give you that control when you need it. So that was a quick whiz through of Cube. I know it's not very exciting, but we'll try and make things exciting now by dealing with the best programming language in the world, HTML. Hell yeah. That's so exciting. Right, so home is where the HTML is, right? The most important part of a web page is the HTML. It's the foundation of a web page. It describes the content to the user. It provides structure to the tool that's rendering the page for you. And speaking of tools, it gives tools this information to help them to help you to consume the content. Now, this tool might be a screen reader, or it might even be the reader view in your browser that helps you read an article without all the horrible adverts and pop-ups. And it might even be a scraping tool that pulls the web page out and takes the content from it. It doesn't matter. If you use semantic HTML, then those tools can do their job properly. And by semantic HTML, I mean at least a heading hierarchy, so then the page makes sense. And this is also a really important part of this too, is that if, I say if on the slide, but actually it's when the CSS doesn't load, the website will still make sense. And this is because browsers style the page themselves with user agent styles. So these are styles that get built into the browser. And if you use semantic HTML, the correct user agent styles will be applied, and therefore the page will make sense. And then lastly, good old browsers, you know, the old legacy ones, they're not going to support some of the CSS that I'm going to show you today. What we're not going to do is write loads of hacks and backward compatibility polyfills. What we're actually going to do is let the browser degrade gracefully instead and present just the HTML to the user. Because if we're using semantic HTML, the user is going to get a good experience rather than a wonky old hack together experience that we might have done previously. You get the HTML right, and you've built yourself a solid foundation. If you don't get the HTML right, you build it on sand. And then what happens when you build on sand? Everything sinks. So this is the outline of our page, right? The page that I've just shown you. And as you can see, it's quite simple. We've got body, and then inside of the body, we've got a main element, which describes it as the main content. And then inside of there, we've got a header, And then each section is an article. And you might be thinking, what's he doing using articles for that? Surely the whole thing's an article because it is one big article. Well, good old Uncle Bruce Lawson wrote an article back in 2020 where he essentially described a section as a generic wrapper, almost like a spicy div. And what an article does more efficiently is it explains chunks of content. So I used to think an article was a singular, but actually many articles help the page to be digested. So that completely transformed how I write HTML, and that's why I've broken everything into articles. And then when this works, this is what we've got now. And that's it. See you later. Bye. All done. Thank you. Cheers. I'm not actually going to go yet. Maybe in a minute. But this is how the browser renders the page, because we've got all these default user agent styles, and we've used semantic HTML. We've given the browser everything it needs to do to make the page make sense. And it does make sense, right? You can see a heading hierarchy, you can see lists, you can see links, you can see all the important bits in order to understand the web page. And that's what's so powerful about HTML. It will just work because browsers are really good at rendering HTML, even if it's broken. So we'll talk about more HTML as we go along, but let's talk about the real fun stuff now. Let's start programming some CSS. So speaking of foundations, we've got ourselves a really solid foundation. We've put some piles down. We've got a real solid concrete base with our HTML. What we want to start doing now is adding another layer of foundation in order to level the playing field for ourselves. Now, this is a CSS reset that I wrote about quite a long time ago now. And really, it's a compressed version of resets that I've been using over the years doing client work. And what we're going to do today is we're actually going to use a further compressed version of this reset. But what a reset does is because user agent styles are actually quite consistent across browsers, but what the reset does is it just creates these little tweaks for us just to help us build things in a more predictable fashion. So just remind ourselves, this is what we've got at the moment, beautiful looking HTML web page. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add just these 42 lines of CSS, and that's it. And all we're going to do on here is we're going to set our box model to make things a bit more predictable with sizing. And then we're going to do some, remove some list styles, do some text sizing stuff, yada, yada, boring stuff. But what it does give us is this. The page now looks almost exactly the same, right? But the difference is now it's a bit more compressed. I've removed that spacing because I'm going to deal with that myself in a minute. And I've removed a couple of list styles. And that's it. It's really, really like low impact. But it's just adding that layer of foundational work for us. And what it does is it allows us to then start to think about applying the cube methodology to our page. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to start doing global CSS. But just like with Emily's talk earlier, we want to start dealing with some design tokens. And we want to start dealing with some constants that will help us to build a consistent user interface. Now, these are all generated CSS custom properties, and what they are is native CSS variables. And these have actually been generated by Tailwind CSS, of all tools. What I did there is I wrote some JavaScript, and it spat out this for me. Job done. Using Tailwind at what I think it's good at. And then what I've done to assist with those variables is I've written some handwritten variables too, and they use those tokens that I've already added. So I've set a consistent gutter for all the layouts. I've set some border radius, a couple of transitions, and then tracking, which is the space between letters, to get that nice consistency with our rendered text. So with that, we've got another foundational layer. We've got the variables that we can use to create consistency across our page. And then all we need to do now is add 8 lines of CSS, and that's going to completely transform our entire page. Because what we're using here is all inheritable properties. What that means is any element that finds itself inside of the body is going to inherit the styles that are defined on the body. So we only need to define them once, and then the browser will do the rest for us. And what we get is this. And already that's had a massive impact on the page, right? We've got a decent font now. We've got ourselves some decent letter spacing, so everything's looking decent. How many times can I say decent in 2 minutes? Lots of times. But you see where I'm going with this. I'm just making low impact changes. Well, actually, sorry, low code changes that have a massive impact. Now I'm going to take us on a little detour now because I'm going to introduce you to my current obsession with responsive design, and that's fluid typography and fluid space. And we're going to use this as our context, this little demo. As you can see, it's got humongous type, but then it's also got these tiny little paragraphs too. Now you might be thinking, that's fine, we'll just create some breakpoints and we'll just change the font size for each breakpoint. You know, the good old classic iPad, MacBook, blah, blah. But we're not going to do that. And the reason why we're not going to do that is because of this. Now this is a diagram from a 2015 Open Signal report on screen size fragmentation on Android devices. Now there's two things to mention here about this diagram. One is in 2015, which is 7 years ago. And two, this is just Android devices. So when you put into the mix all the other types of devices you've got too, you've got your Apple devices, you've got Windows, you've got all these other things. You've got browsers in cars, you've got browsers on fridges, you've got browsers all over the shop. It's almost impossible to know what size the viewport's going to be at any given time. So using like 2, 3, 4 breakpoints seems a bit silly at that point, right? And when we do that, we get this. It's honky-tonky. The sizing's wrong in between viewport sizes. The text is never quite right unless you use these optimum breakpoint sizes, which almost no one ever will. I mean, the CSS is all right, okay? You know, I'm setting mobile up and I'm building the font size up as the breakpoints go. So you're thinking, it's fine, just add more breakpoints. Well, that's cool. Let's add another one. Well, that's not going to make much of an impact. So how many breakpoints do I need to add in order to account for all of those screen sizes? It's going to be a ridiculous amount of CSS. What if I said you can do this with one line of CSS and not have to deal with any breakpoints? Because this is truly responsive typography, because it's responding to the viewport itself. And how we do that is use this outrageously clever function in CSS called clamp. And what clamp lets you do is you set a minimum size at the start, and then you set an ideal size in the middle, and then finally you have the maximum size that goes with it. So the minimum and the maximum size are pretty straightforward, right? We're using relative units, and we're saying, okay, start at 2 rem, and then if you get up to 10 rem, just give up at that point. But then in the middle is where the real magic happens, and the magic that I have absolutely no idea how it works. But it doesn't matter, because I just know how to apply it. But what we do is we say, look, try and base the size of the font on 5 portions of the width of the viewport. But the really important part is that we're using calc and adding a relative unit to that calculation. Because if we didn't do that, as the user zoomed in, the viewport would shrink, so the text would never grow. So what this does is say to the browser, look, try and give us a proper relative unit based on that calculation instead. So it does some bonkers maths that I don't understand, and it gives us back this completely fluid font size. And that's really cool, isn't it? Because look, it just works. And everything is looking tickety-boo. But we can make it look better. Because now we're going to start to implement some proper design practice into it too. And we're going to start implementing size and space scales so that although the typography is responding to the viewport, we want it to respond via a ratio too, so you get natural flow and rhythm as you go down the page. And this is what I mean by a type scale. We use a ratio to increase the size by a certain amount each time, and you get this lovely linear curve between sizes. And what we're using here is what's called a major third scale, and that has a ratio of 1.25. So for each time you go up the scale, the font size increases by 1.25. And that's how you get that lovely scale. But that's only one type scale. How do we deal with the situation where we've got quite a conservative scale for smaller viewports, but then a much more aggressive scale for larger viewports? Step up my favorite tool on the web. And this is called Utopia. And it's put together by the devilishly clever folks at Clearleft, an agency in Brighton. And the two people that made it, Tris Mudford and James Gillihead, are a dream team combination of designer and front-end developer that are like linked at the brain or something. They're telepathic almost in how they work with each other. And they created this tool because this formalized how they were building websites anyway, this sort of utopian fluid scale. And it's really helpful for our project because this is our type scale that we're using. And as you can see, on the smallest viewport, we're using quite a small root font size, 16, which you should always try and make that the smallest you ever go, ideally. And we're using a type scale of 1.2, so it's going to have quite a shallow curve. But then for larger viewports, 1350 is the width of the wrapper, just for fun. And we're bumping the font size up because we've got more screen real estate. And we're also using a much more aggressive ratio, an augmented fourth, which has got a ratio of 1.414. And you put all that into Utopia, and it does some magic, which Tristan tried to explain to me once, and I actually felt brain falling out of my ears as he was trying to explain it to me. But it doesn't matter, because all it gives me is this. And you're looking at it and you think, God, some seriously ugly CSS, right? Like, who's going to be able to read that? But it doesn't matter, because we set this up at the high level as variables that we can access, and we set them once and we forget about them forever. Because now we've got a fluid type system that's running on 2 different type scales, and the browser's picking the right type scale based on the size of the viewport. And we never have to do anything ever again. I can retire now, it doesn't matter, doesn't it? Job done. Everyone's a winner. So spacing is near enough the same deal with this tool. So we're not just dealing with typography sizing, we're dealing with spacing between elements, either side. And again, we're using a fluid scale, because you're going to want smaller space on smaller viewports and then larger space on larger viewports. Now, the difference is we can't use the type scales by default in Utopia, because depending on the type scale you use, the distance between spaces is going to be far too aggressive and difficult to manage. So we want something a bit smaller. But we're still using the root font size to create these. So you can see there on the smaller viewports, you've got smaller blocks, and in the larger viewports, you've got larger blocks. There's not much difference between the sizes, is there? What we can do to remedy that, though, is this cool thing that they do where they allow you to create these spacing pairs. So you pick the smallest value for the smallest viewport, and then the largest value from the larger viewport, and then you let the browser work out the rest. And that's represented by these nice lines between. And what we can also do is create custom space scales, which I've used for the site that we're looking at today. So you see on the larger viewports, there's big chunks of content with lots of space between them. But then as you go up and you see the smaller viewports, those chunks get much more compressed. And that's because I'm picking a much smaller base size and a much larger size in order to create that. One line of CSS, job done. Easy peasy. So that was a bit of an information overload. I apologize for that. That might be the last one. I can't remember. But we're going to get back to our CSS, and we're going to start actually writing some code now. Well, we say writing some code. I'm going to show you on slides. I was actually going to live code this, but I actually remembered that would be a very stupid thing to do. So I'm doing it like this instead. So this is where we're at. We've set these properties up. And as you can see, those fluid space type scales are being used already. And then what we're going to do now that we've got these base styles, we've got our fluid typography and spacing system in place, we can really start to increase the amount of CSS that we're putting on the page. And the first thing we're going to do is actually deal with headings and do some typesetting. So the first rule I've written there is I'm picking the top 3 heading and I'm saying push the line height down, because the text is going to be quite large for these headings. And that's a bit of a design pro tip for you, that as the size of the text increases, you want to decrease the ratio of the line height as much as your font allows. Now we're using Inter as our font on this page, and that's got quite shallow ascenders and descenders, which are the uppy bits and the downy bits. And if they don't overlap with each other, then it's all good. You might have to increase that, but you should try and keep it like 1.2, 1.3, something like that. And that will immediately transform your designs. And then we're working down the type scale to do the heading hierarchy. So we're going to pick larger size, and then we're going to go down the scale and then down again. And for free, we've got ourselves a fluid type system. And then sticking with typesetting too, there's another little cheeky tip that I can give you here. And this is both making things look wicked and also making things behave nicely for people too. Now, this is something I see on a lot of developer sites and documentation sites where the line lengths are really long. Now, there's 2 problems here. 1, it looks rubbish. And 2, when someone's got cognitive issues, if they're having to read a long line length and then skip down to another line and then start again, they can lose where they are in the text. So what we can do to remedy that is shrink the length of those lines, so it makes the content more readable and it makes it look good too. And you might be thinking, what's that CH unit all about? It's a handy unit that we get with CSS that's equal to the width of a 0 character at the rendered font size and the chosen font. So you know by using a CH unit that the width that you set, or the amount of characters that you set, is going to be relative to the size of the type that you're dealing with at any given time. Now I'm using really chunky type on this, so I've chosen quite a short line length because the characters are much bigger. Really what you should be aiming for is about 65 to 75 characters if you're using like a roughly 16 pixel font. And then for headings, I'm pushing that down even further because it's even larger text. And just that little bit of CSS will completely transform your website just by doing that. This thing's not playing nice today, is it? Here we go. So then I'm doing some more global CSS, I'm styling block quotes, I'm doing link styles, SVGs. Just doing as much as I can as high as possible. It's quite a simple design this, so I'm not having to write too much global CSS, but enough to get us by. And then what we end up with is this. What a transformation. And you can see those line lengths already in place, and you can see that nice fluid type. And the SVGs are starting to look decent now. They're not blowing up all over the place. It's all starting to look nice and tight. Now we're in a good position with this foundation to start adding some attention to detail. And the first step to doing that is to pick up some utilities. Now remember, in CubeCSS, a utility is a CSS class that does one job and does that one job well. Now we've already got Tailwind generating all the boring ones for us, like background color, text color, all those. What we're going to do is we're going to write some utilities to go with them. And the first one is my favorite 3 lines of CSS ever. Now people watch my talks before, I go, oh, for God's sake, he's going flow again. But this is where I peaked, right? I should have retired years ago, but I keep going, I keep blattering on about it. But what I've done here is I'm using what's called the lobotomized owl selector, and that's the star plus star selector. And that was coined by my very good friend and co-author Hayden Pickering. A very Hayden name for a selector, isn't it? But the problem with the lobotomized owl selector is, and this has been the root of our debates for a long time with each other, is that recursively selects sibling elements inside the page. So it'll pick each sibling and add space to it. And that, you reduce the amount of control you got by doing that, because you never know what elements are going to have what space in them. So what I do is I qualify the selector with a combinator, as it's called, and that's the arrow. And what that does is it changes it from being a recursive selector to being just a single level, only direct descendants will get this space on it. The second part to note is, I'm going to do what Jay did because that was pretty cool. You see there, the var. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for a CSS custom property, CSS variable, of flow space. And if I can't find that variable, I'm going to give it a fallback value instead and say, if you can't find that, use this. And I'm using 1m as the fallback value. And what that does is it allows the spacing of each element to be based on its font size. Now you might be thinking, well, that's going to be a bit inconsistent though, isn't it? But it's not, because remember we're using a type scale. So everything's based on a ratio. So even this m-based spacing that we're using now has got natural flow and rhythm that's just based on the typography that it's affecting at any given time. And that's pretty handy, right? 3 lines of CSS, job done. Now I can walk off. But let's add some more control tricks. We all love a bit of control, don't we? So what we can do with flow is say, right, in this context, so let's say I've made a class called myContext that sits above flow or on flow. And I'm saying, set the flow space to be 10 rem. And what that gives you instead is this consistent space in between each element, because the var function is looking for this custom property value, and if it can find it, it's using it. And if it can't find it, it's going to apply that space. Now, what we're going to look at now, well, first I'm going to have a drink, and it's going to be really awkward. But let's still go. Remind yourselves of the page while I do this. Pretty cool, right? So, in the realms of spacing, we want to start talking about these chunks of content, because we're going to use the same tiny amount of CSS to control these chunks of content across the whole site. So I call them regions, and I've made a utility called region. And what it does, very similar to flow, is it adds top and bottom spacing, and using the same strategy of looking for a variable of region space. And if it can't find that, it's using that custom pair I was talking about, where I'm picking the smallest value for large and the largest value for 2XL, and then letting the browser work out what the space is. And that's how we get these chunks, right? So all of these chunks have been dealt with 4 lines of CSS. All the space in between elements has been dealt with 3 lines of CSS. Job done, nice and easy. And then when we look at the page in its current form, you can see it's had a huge impact on the page, right? Sure, there's some massive space between elements, but it's all being just controlled by these 2 utilities that I'm just plopping all over the place in the HTML. So I've got my utilities in place. I've added another layer of foundational work to the site. So I can start building on that now. Notice how I'm always building on top, progressively enhancing, as you might think. And what we're going to start looking at now is some layout. And the layout that we're going to deal with is this. There's 2 grids. There's a grid here that's a 2x2 grid. And then there's a grid here that's 3 column. Now, you might be thinking, surely he's going to get breakpoints out of his pocket for this one. Absolutely not. No, we're going to use an algorithm instead. Because remember, CSS is a programming language, right? And we're going to say, use the grid system, and then we're going to define the columns. So with CSS Grid, you can define columns and rows because it's a 2D layout system. And what we're saying to grid is, for all of your columns, you can repeat this logic, and you can say, find the grid placement first. And what we're saying is, if you can't find that, use autofill as the default. And what autofill does is it tells grid to keep creating columns as it's got space. And then what we're telling grid is how big we want the columns to be. So again, we're looking for grid min item size as the variable. If we can't find that, we're giving it a decent and a fallback, 16 rem. So I think it's about 280 pixels or something like that. Notice how I'm only dealing with, I don't know, because we're mentoring the browser, we're not micromanaging it. And then what we're saying is for your maximum size for the column, just pick a portion of the remaining space, which is what the FI unit does, the fractal unit. As long as all the grid items have got that same definition, which they do by proxy of the repeater, they're all going to take equal space from the remaining space. And then we end up with this. It looks rubbish, doesn't it? Is this why all the lads are using Tailwind then? It makes things just a lot easier. But we can make it easy for ourselves, right? We're not going to use breakpoints. We're not going to write some horrible CSS to fix it. We're just going to lean into the browser and let it do it for us instead. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use a bug as a feature. So the good old Apple, in their wisdom, with Safari and VoiceOver, which is Apple's screen reader, in certain versions of Safari and VoiceOver, if you add a class to a list element, it removes the list semantics, which is not very smart, is it? But so the resolution to that is to add an ARIA role of list to it. So we're going to use this as an opportunity though, instead of wallowing over it. And we're going to use this as a hook. Now that CSS reset I talked about earlier has done some of the lifting for us already. It's already looking for that role selector, and it's removing list styles because there's a decent assumption that if someone's adding a class to a list, there's a good chance they don't want it to look like a normal list anymore. Then what I'm going to add to the global CSS is an enhancement to that. And I'm going to say, look, because of this design that we're working with today, lists with this role attribute also are going to have no padding on them too. And you can see with that attribute selector there, I've been able to just pick it up. And then we've got this. Still looks rubbish. So how do we deal with this now? And then I can feel someone thinking, come on, it's got to be breakpoint time now, surely. Hell no. We're going to lean into that strategy that we've set already by, every time we're looking for a custom property, we're giving it a fallback. We're actually just going to define these custom properties instead to give ourselves a little bit of control back. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell grid to use auto fit placement rather than autofill. And what this does is, instead of filling the space with columns, it allows grid to make its mind up for itself to either to increase the width of the column or to create more columns. We're not going to tell it what to do. We're just going to let it make its own mind up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give it a guide on how to size these columns. So remember the default size for the grid was 16 rem. We're going to nick that value because we like that one. And we're going to use clamp again, just like we've used for spacing and typography. And we're going to set our minimum value as 16 and then our maximum value of 26 rem. Just picking numbers out of the air for that. Because the real magic is in the middle. Now what I'm doing here is I'm saying use half of the screen width as your guide. And you might be thinking, but it's in a wrapper. It's never going to be half of the screen width. But it doesn't matter because we're not telling the browser what to do. We're just giving it an idea of what we're after. And then we're letting it do all the work for us instead because surely you don't want to do all that work yourself. And what you get is this, a completely responsive grid system. We're just defining these two properties and no one's sweated. And it's all good, easy peasy. So with that system in place, we've built another layer of foundation. We're getting more and more solid as we go. Then we can start adding some real detail. And what we're going to do is we're going to stick on those cards that we were looking at then. And we're going to do some colouring in. Because that's essentially what you're doing with blocks at this point. We're doing the colouring in bit. So you can see they've got a darker background, they've got lighter text. So we need to go against the global CSS for this. So we create ourselves a little class, a little block class. And we're going to pick some design tokens out and we're going to apply them for the background and the colour. And then we're going to pick an item from the space and scale as our padding. And then we're going to apply that CSS variable that we were up before as the border radius. So as you can see, all these foundational elements are starting to come together now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make an assumption, which you should do lightly. But what this assumption does is say there's a very good chance that if someone's applying a class of card, they're going to be applying it to a list by proxy of what cards are. Now remember this global CSS we wrote earlier when we were setting the max width of the lines. We actually want to unset that because our card needs to be controlled by the compositional layout instead, rather than the global CSS. So by using the unset keyword, we're telling the browser, ignore that, what you were told earlier. Let whatever you're in determine your size instead. And then we end up with this. Now this is looking all right. It's not looking great. There's this big horrible space here that we don't like. So we start to think, well, how can we fix this? By using nice flexible CSS. What we could do is do a masonry layout. And what a masonry layout is when the layout is, the space is picked by the system and it creates that like brickwork effect. Now, there we go. So to do that, we're going to create another exception. So that first exception, the 50-50 layout, we've added already, and that was setting the columns. Now we want to deal with the rows of the grid system instead. Now we haven't defined any rows for the grid yet, and that's fine because we're just letting the browser make its own mind up for them. But what we're going to do now instead is we're going to get some control back, and we're going to say, for every row that you create, you use the masonry system. Now, that's not very well supported. In fact, it's barely supported in any browsers yet. So you think, oh, he's going to get a polyfill out, surely. No, I'm just going to write it and forget about it. And then we're going to enhance that minimum viable experience. So by setting the grid alignment to start rather than stretch, which is default, it'll allow items to grow with the content instead. And this is progressive enhancement in action, because the only way you can see a masonry layout at the moment is by using a flag in Firefox, and that's it. No other browser supports it, and that's fine. Because what we end up with is this. This is our minimum viable experience now. And it actually looks all right, doesn't it? I can almost guarantee that when you loaded that set of cards on your device, you didn't even think it was a masonry layout, because that's the magic of progressive enhancement. You don't know whether or not you've got the most optimal experience, because the optimal experience is the experience that works for you at that given time on that given device. If we fire it up in Firefox, it makes quite a subtle change, but what you can see there is it's packing the columns into as much space as it can find to create that consistent space between elements. And that's it. 2 lines of CSS, job done. Set and forget. One day it'll work and it'll look great, but until then, it looks great already. So let's do a last bit of coding now. We've done a lot of coding this afternoon, haven't we? What we're going to do is we're going to tackle this. Now, this is how I like to work with the Cube CSS. So when I write blocks in Cube CSS, I like to treat them like little configuration objects a lot of the time. So we're going to configure all these different parts of the page in one concise block. Because remember, we've got global CSS, we've got utilities, we've got compositions already. So we can start to tweak how they behave based in the context that we're setting here, which I've called features, which is just a load of tech crap that I like to use. Now, this is the block that I've written. So just like I was doing with these layout exceptions, I'm setting the grid placement to be auto-fit, which is telling the grid system to size the columns rather than create new ones. And then I'm saying the grid item size, and again, I'm just picking numbers out of the air as the minimum and the maximum. And then I'm saying to the browser, look, try and make it into thirds if you can. And then I'm targeting the gutter for the layout, and I'm creating more space between the elements. And then I'm targeting the flow utility, and I'm saying set the flow space to be small on the space scale. And then I'm adding a couple of bits of other CSS, some fancy bits to make it look nice. But other than that, that's all that block does. Tiny bit of CSS, because at this point, so much is already powering this design that we don't really need to write much at all. And with that, we've got the website. Now, I haven't gone into full detail because I don't think you want to be sat here till 8 o'clock at night, do you? But you get the gist of how I've built this thing, right? But if you are intrigued about the rest of it, then what I've done is I've put all the source code up on Glitch. And Glitch is like fancy code pen. You get a bit of extra power. And you can see all like the Eleventy stuff that's running on it as well. And that's a static site generator. And then all the little bits of CSS and the Tailwind and all that rubbish. And you can see how it all comes together to create this nice, concise CSS system. So let me do a bit of theory to close out. We've never had it better with browsers, right? I've been doing this thing since about 2009. And back then, responsive design was just about to come around the corner, but we were dealing with horrible browsers like IE6, IE7, even IE5. There was a period, which is probably the darkest period, where we had to build responsive websites that also supported IE6, which is absolute hell. I hate to think about it even now. And I think a lot of frameworks and tools that are heavy-handed are actually a pretty reasonable reaction to this previous problem that we had. And I emphasize previous because it's no longer a problem. Browsers are so much more compatible with each other now. The playing field is so much more level than it used to be. So really these tools are redundant at this point, surely. Well, I say redundant. What I like to think of them is repurposed instead. Sure, there's going to be some tools that are like taking a sledgehammer to crack an egg. They're redundant. We don't need them anymore. But in the context of Tailwind, instead of using that to micromanage your browser and set utility classes on every single element, a better way to use it is just to create utility classes to be used when you want to use them and to create these CSS custom properties as well. Repurpose the tool to be a useful tool for me rather than a tool. So you might be thinking, well, that's cool, Andy. You've created this like pretty all right looking website and it's pretty simple. What about the real world though? Will it scale, as everyone likes to say? Well, I can tell you that it does, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this exact methodology in the wild today. So you've already seen a couple of links to this site already today. Last year, Google hired us to build them a design system, and we built that using this exact methodology because the aim of the game was, this is a massive website, this is an unbelievably large website, and in that site, there's loads of content, and they're expanding into more detailed content. So there's this Learn CSS course there, which we did some bits with as well last year, and all these new bits that are coming up in the future. And what they wanted was the developers to have this foundation to be able to put pages together in the future with little to no design influence, which is great. And they're doing exactly that now. And this is a humongous website. But it's not just huge websites also. We can build hyper-creative websites as well. Now, there is a content one in here because there's going to be a lot of glitching and flashing on the page, but it's worth it. So this is a site that we were hired to build for another agency. And as you can see, there's all this glitching and fancy stuff going on. There's like progressive loading of elements and all this. Now, we're using the exact same system to build this website that we've built this little demo for this talk. Because we've built a really solid foundation, we were able to get really expressive with the fancy glitches and all that sort of stuff, knowing full well that where they weren't supported, the user would still get a really good experience. So everyone gets a good experience, regardless, and no one knows whether they're getting the best experience or not, because we're just letting the browser make these decisions for us instead. Now, all of the CSS and everything is much lighter than your favorite CSS framework's homepage, and it looks a lot better. So, to close, I'll leave you with this message, and I want you to take this home and think about it. Now, remember, always be the browser's mentor. Help it to help you, rather than forcing it to do something that you think is the ideal. And then the other thing is to always challenge over-complex solutions that either you or someone else comes up with. Always try to simplify things as much as possible, because with all that, you can go forth and build excellent websites. Thank you very much.